What a build-up. And I completely agree with Paul that we certainly heard some truth bombs as from Anna Marie and from Johnny. And what a privilege to have a session on internal communications that is actually grown up, thoughtful, original and actionable. So it was a pleasure to come to the Provoke conference and listen to that and some of the other things I've heard. The reason I am standing on a stage to tell you a story about a family funeral is because, as Anna Marie said in the last session, communications can and should provide value. And I think although this is a big canvas, understandable event, the key point is that the communication work was a central element for bringing a nation together, and something we didn't anticipate, sending a message around the world about good governance, about a lifelong service, about the importance of tradition and respect. And so I want to tell that story. The summary of it is very simple. If you want the takeaway, then I think I can sum it up in 4 words: talent, teamwork, collaboration, and credibility. And for those of you who are feeling a bit old and tired, like Richard Bagnall, I will just tell you the short story at the start, so that is clear. The talent point is, in my experience, starting off as a press officer, and I think 1992, there were press officers and then there were evil people in marketing and internal comms we didn't really care about and so on. Certainly in the team we put together for London Bridge, the understanding that teamwork had to flow from having all the disciplines in the room, the data scientists, the digital wizards, the behavioural experts, as well as the PR and marketing people. And the magic happens, picking up on something that Johnny said, when you have a diversity of skills and views and you share them and you argue and debate through what happens. Talent and teamwork. The collaboration point is that it is easy in corporate life and certainly in public services where I work to forget to collaborate, to create organisation silos, sometimes to think the worst of people. But we were able to build a collaborative national venture involving the royal households, 4 governments, the governments of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the United Kingdom as a whole, and up to 300 public service organisations. But then the fourth point about credibility. So every day during London Bridge, the funeral process, there was a ministerial meeting with the British government where I was the communications advisor. And we were the ministers were complaining about an article in the Daily Telegraph, who, for those of you not familiar with the Daily Telegraph, is a broadsheet newspaper. I guess it has about 1 million readers on a regular basis. And they were arguing about this one piece about how the funeral process wasn't going according to plan and the public services weren't doing their thing. And they looked at me, what are you going to do about it? I'm not going to do anything about it. Why is that? Because that article's probably been read by about 100,000 people. David Beckham, the famous footballer, has got 13.5 million views of his story of standing in the queue to see the lying in state on TikTok. People went, wow, that's interesting. I said, look, ministers, that is why the data dashboard that I provide on a daily basis that talks about media sentiment in Zimbabwe and Qatar, 2 countries that, to our surprise and delight in a humble way, were absolutely fascinated by the funeral and the process and what was going on. And the volume of social media I talk about and tell you about on a daily basis, ministers, on TikTok and Facebook and Instagram. And actually, this tells a story about a strongly visual video tale from Britain that's going around the world. And you really don't need to worry about the Daily Telegraph, important though that is. So that's how I hope that illustrates that's how I drove the communications credibility. On the screen behind you, a nod to the marketeers and the branding experts. The branding that you see was used to commemorate the funeral was taken up by private and public sector organisations, was used all around the country, was particularly powerful at the national moment of reflection we organised. And the reason we did that, where everyone stopped on a Sunday night just ahead of the funeral for a minute, is that when we talked to the behavioural scientists about, does this matter? Are people going to be upset about the death of their head of state, a woman that they will have seen throughout their life? Does it matter? And behavioural scientists said, yes, it is like a death in the family. And unless you give people agency and an ability to commemorate it in their way, then they won't feel like the government has done its job. There's a young man called Ethan who designed this for us in-house and so on, and it was taken up with alacrity. The advertisers took down their adverts for all sorts of products around the United Kingdom and used it, and it provided a fantastic national backdrop. You've seen the pictures, you will recognise some of those pictures, but I cannot overemphasise the power of the visual message, which really underpinned all that we did. It's been my privilege and fortune to help lead UK government communications through a series of extraordinary moments. The Brexit campaign was the biggest at the time government communications campaign. Then came COVID, and Johnny touched on that. Then came, tragically, the war in the Ukraine, and then the royal funeral. And as I sat with the then Prime Minister on the evening that the Queen died, and I've done the same, the war in Ukraine with Boris Johnson, COVID with Boris Johnson, and similarly with other Prime Ministers, an absolutely critical part of the decision-making process to demonstrate the value that communications can add is, what do you want to achieve here? Prime Minister, Minister, Chief Executive, whoever it is, when this is over, what do you want us to be able to look back? And I fear that too many communicators, too much of the time, rush straight to implementation, rush straight to the tactical delivery without standing back and saying, right, what is the thing we want to do there, which is set out on the screen. And those objectives were the thing that with our team we looked at every morning and every evening, how far we were getting there. I'm talking about the government side of this, but of course this was a funeral of a much loved mother, grandmother, great grandmother, and we were always very clear that the royal family, the new king, and the family and the royal households in the round, it was their event which we were supporting, and I should absolutely credit the way that they led that, and the stream of digital content which was consumed, which was liked, which was shared around the world. So you're familiar with the, it was a 10-day process. It was 11 days in the end because of the time at which the Queen's death was announced. 6:30 on the Thursday. It all looks fairly straightforward, but of course there were lots of bumps in the road, and having a communications team at the heart of that could deal with the sense of frustration when normal life was disrupted by the mourning process, that could deal with some of the things that happened on the way. I'll talk a little bit about state-led disinformation, but also the arrest of protesters, which was perceived at the time to be heavy-handed, and some of the other things we had to put in place were absolutely critical. It seems, in retrospect, relatively straightforward, but I would just remind colleagues that this was a massive national and international event. I think in the end we had about 150 heads of state or heads of government in Westminster Abbey at the funeral, all with their own delegations. There was a lovely sort of a diplomatic row we avoided, where all the heads of state, apart from those who needed absolutely special close protection, like the President of the United States, had to be taken to Chelsea, where they were brought together and put in coaches to go to Westminster Abbey. And there was a lot of back and forth about, can we have the Israelis with this country or the French with that country? Will they get on in the coaches? Are the coaches suitable for heads of state? Will it all work? And negotiating that was something that was carried out by my colleagues. But nevertheless, 10 days to deliver an event of this stage, a funeral in the digital age. The numbers you will be probably can guess at. It did surprise us how much interest there was, and it also surprised us, those figures from YouGov, about the fact that after the event and the power of communications to shape this, the public, at least in the UK, but the evidence we have from overseas, said that actually we feel rather proud that this did bring the nation together, that we gave the Queen a proper send-off. At the heart of this operation and the particular piece that I led was the News and Communication Centre. And that is my point about talent and teamwork. We had trained, we had prepared, we had exercised, and that is essential for the teamwork and the specific delivery. But bringing that team together, working essentially 24/7 over 11 days straight, means clarity of objectives, means clarity of roles, means absolutely flawless liaison across all those agencies, requires humility and listening, as well as getting the job done. You can see some of the products I've highlighted on there. The grid to bring together all the activities, the way that other agencies, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, wanted to celebrate what they did, the daily advisories, the run of meetings, and so on. In terms of the credibility, I would, the data and the tools we brought together, tools many of you will be familiar with, particularly Brandwatch and Signal AI, were tools that really help give confidence to the leaders of my organisation, the UK government, that the communications was having an effect and we were on top of the communications and could execute the plan. Google were inevitably involved in this because the single most symbolic element of all of this was the queue. The at times 10-mile long, 24-hour to wait queue for roughly 250,000 people to file past the Queen's coffin. And this was central to what we wanted to give the public in terms of a degree of agency and ability to commemorate the late Queen. When we said to Google, could you do this on YouTube? They said, we don't quite know how, but we worked with them and we came up with this YouTube channel that enabled people to do it and was a really powerful way of helping people understand the length of what we can do. I've talked about the branding, and my colleagues estimate, as it says there, 59 million people seeing the artwork and 4 billion views. But the point I want to make is the power of bringing the PR and the branding and the internal and external communications together. And indeed, the media logistics. Of course, you can do great branding, you can put on a national moment of reflection, you can work on the digital content that goes around the world, but there was also a series of professions, a series of movements from the coffin, originally from Scotland, from Balmoral, and then by plane via Edinburgh down to London, and then the actual funeral itself. And managing the media and some of the numbers there is an underrated skill, the ability to get the media to where they needed to be, to keep them happy, to make sure they got their shots and pictures, and liaise when the public wanted to get in the media pens and all those things. So again, I'm seeking to emphasise the nature of a cross-government event. I think we were surprised at the global media reaction, and there, as we track this around the world, the fact that Finland, France, Qatar, Zimbabwe, the UAE, and the United States, where a quarter of Americans say they watched at least part of the funeral, was an extraordinary revelation for us, and perhaps indicative of the sense of loss. But it had the content that we produced turned into a massive global event. There were many positive comments. There were also negative comments. And sadly, we live in a world where we are always aware of the desire of states, particularly at times the Russian state, and more usually, and then sometimes the Chinese state. And it was very interesting what happened, because on the day of the announcement of the Queen's funeral, we saw that the official Russian channels and the Chinese channels were suitably respectful and said, this is a world leader who's died, and so on. They very quickly switched to saying, well, is this the end for Britain? Is this a more divided Britain? Is this a country that is going to fail and it's all downwards? But what happened after that, as you can see from the peaks and troughs, is the sheer weight of coverage, the visuals, the pictures, the video content on TikTok, of the queue, on YouTube, of the funeral, of the lying in state, of the royal households, putting out pictures of looking at the Queen throughout her life, the public reaction from London and also Belfast and Edinburgh and Cardiff, drowned out the disinformation. And the state-led disinformation channels essentially switched off. They decided it wasn't worth trying to critique Britain over this period. A lot of organisations involved in the heart of this, and anyone who's worked in government or indeed any big bureaucracy will understand that it is not easy to get those things going. But again, if you're the communicator and you're sitting at the top table, that clarity of objectives to me is absolutely central to what we are trying to do. On the screen, 5 lessons. I mean, through COVID, through Brexit, through the war in Ukraine and certainly the royal funeral, as someone who has had the privilege to lead teams, it's like we're either all on the same footprint and we bring all the communication skills together and we listen to the voices in the room and we respect all of them and work out how we can improve and are continually thinking about how we get better and celebrating success and thinking about what works. But everyone has got to be together. We will not win. I've talked about data. I've probably underestimated the point about fail to prepare and prepare to fail. One of the saddest things I've done in the last couple of years, which as Paul said, has been quite challenging in all sorts of ways, was the exercises we ran through to prepare for a likely Russian invasion of Ukraine in December of I think it was last year anyway, but ahead of the invasion. London Bridge, the funeral, and Springtide, the name we gave to the accession of the new king, was also something we trained and prepared for. And the point I would make there as a senior communicator in the room when you've got the soldiers who are going to do their ceremonial and the bureaucrats and the people who run the lying in state in the Palace of Westminster and so on, is the communicator can bring the public into the room and say, look, your plans are brilliant, but you're going to have protesters and you're going to have people who really want to show their loyalty and sorrow at the death of the Queen. And you're going to have a tornado of social media and your plans are going to have to adapt. And sometimes people don't like hearing that, but eventually they respect that. So the preparation is absolutely critical. Consistency of messaging, I hope, would be obvious to you. And a final point I would make is it was a family funeral, a royal funeral. And partly the communications operation that I led on behalf of the government was to create the space, intervene where it was necessary to tackle disinformation, intervene to deliver some big set-piece moments like the national moment of reflection, but also clear the way and make it easy for the funeral to take place. The Times were very kind about the whole event, and I was very proud on behalf of all of us who worked in public service that they chose to say, look, this was an example about public services working for public good and bringing the nation together. That is the team. And one final point, in an age when we live life at a speed of a road race and so on, and the lessons can not always be learned and surprisingly sometimes forgotten and have to be relearned. I've just signed off the first draft of our lessons learned report to capture the learning, to help the next generation, and we'll go around and talk about that. And of course, we'll have an opportunity to implement that with an event that I don't think will be on the same scale, but nevertheless will be a big national and probably international moment when King Charles is crowned in May 2023. I hope that that was an interesting story. I hope that was thought-provoking. I've done it with a degree of pace because I recognise that after 5 o'clock on at the end of the conference, I could tell you the long version, but I thought the short version might retain and live in your minds longer. Thank you very much. Paul, am I handing back to you?
Unless you want to do any questions from the audience, we can do a couple of minutes of questions.
I've got a question at the front, and it's Rich and I, who nearly didn't get here, but let's start with the lady. Do let me know who you are.
Kristen Fleur-Perret from Communications.
Hi, Christian.
When you say rehearse, how long was the
Yeah. The long version goes back to the plan was actually 1910. The last plan was the plan for the funeral of Edward VII. And there is on YouTube, you can see the footage, which is actually spookily similar to 2022. I've been involved in this project for 10 years. And everything was rehearsed, and working with the British military or the American military, but the military know how to do things. But certainly, we have been working on the communications plan for 10 years. There was a lot of those that time when people talked about if it happens. It's like, look, I'm sorry, but the Queen will die. We're all going to die, just not today. But getting into that mindset, which clearly became more urgent, but we genuinely had no notice. And the shock in the comms team and having to bring that comms team together and create the News and Communication Centre was something that happened between about 6:30 and 7 on a Thursday evening in London. But we had the ConOps. I gave you a brief glimpse of that. We had exercised it. We had thought through. We had trained 300 volunteers. But we still didn't know. It was quite convenient. The Queen, service to the end, died at a convenient time on a Thursday afternoon. If she died at 2 o'clock in the morning or something, we would have probably scrabbled around. Thank you for the question. Rich.
Thanks, that was brilliant. Rich from CC Group. Slight change. What do you make of Russian information operations, particularly in light of rumours of the Ukrainian dirty bomb over the weekend?
Thank you. Very serious issue, and the President has said this afternoon he's issued a very stark warning about what would happen if the Russians escalated. Any of you got the time or the interest, read Thomas Ridd's book on 100 years of Russian disinformation, or Peter Morozov's book about modern disinformation. When the Russians seek to divide Western societies, create a degree of chaos, and borrowing from Morozov, say that, well, nothing is true and everything is possible. And a lot of this is aimed at their own people, to say, well, if you don't know, they really don't mind whether Russian people just don't know what's going on. Because if you don't know what's going on, and this is Morozov's insight, then the only thing you can be sure of is there's a man in charge, a big man called Putin, who has your best interests at heart. So trust in him. Nothing else is probably true. But if you go with him, then you'll be all right. And lots of brilliant people, the Medusa organisation have done sociological research into Russian science, say most Russians know the whole thing is a sham and a tissue of lies, but they choose to believe it. They believe in Putin because to believe your whole society is based on a whole series of flaws is too much to bear. Every day, Rich, we face a torrent of disinformation. I strongly believe, and the UK government believes, that the fake false flag dirty bomb is because they are losing. Because, an independent, democratic, free nation supported strongly by the United States and everyone, France, Germany, etc., is winning. Fundamentally, because the Ukrainians fight harder and are prepared to die. So given that situation, the Russians, and we monitor Russian media obviously very closely, the mentions of nuclear in Russian media, so the Russians saying nuclear, because they want you to be scared, they want me to be scared, they want us to talk about, God, what happens if there's a nuclear bomb? Doubled over the final 2 weeks of September. Then they dropped off, and then they've started it again. They've talked about the dam, and they've talked about false flag operations. They are trying to prod and see which bits of Western society will go, oh my God, this is too much. Can't we all make it go away? Can't we negotiate, stand down, tell the Ukrainians to stand down? None of this is going to happen, because at the heart of our response in the State Department, the White House, where I've been over the past couple of days, in Downing Street and in Berlin and Paris, deterrence means offering benefits where you can. If you do this or don't do this, it'll help. But it also means being really clear about the costs. And sadly, really sadly, that is the language in terms of our messaging to Russia that seems to work. Thank you very much for the question. I'm sorry it's a slightly deep and serious answer, but it is the issue of our times.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap it up there. Arun?
There's a quick question there. Shout out.
Yeah,
Okay.
Real quick, just in terms of the Queen's passing
Yeah.
and the coronation of the new king, what is your opinion
The short answer, it was extraordinary. And the approval of King Charles went from roughly 40% to 60% on the published polling. The approval of the monarchy went up. 60% of Australians want to keep the monarchy. The American interest and the response to the American government, which we were genuinely humbled by, we didn't expect any of this to happen. The point of giving part of the speech is, you put on this show, you are respectful, you've got a subject who has had a life of service, and people responded in a wonderful way. So I sometimes forget, I work for the head of government, the UK Prime Minister. The head of state is the President in the United States, and the King was the Queen in the UK. So it has, the service zeitgeist has really affected people. The President of Kenya said, the history of modern Kenya is not complete without paying tribute to the role that Queen Elizabeth played. There is a dark side to Britain's colonial past, and we could talk about that and so on, but I think that the Queen has embodied a sense of feel-good and remembrance and service, which I think that we grasp onto in these troubled times. Thank you for the question. I'll shut up now, Paul. Can't see you.
All right,
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Room.
Thank you.